Good day. Yesterday was a very bad day for Ukraine, both on the battlefronts and in terms of the gradual ongoing collapse of Ukraine's energy system. Let me first of all talk about what happened on the battlefronts. Firstly, it's now clear that the Russian military has regained the initiative in the Kharkov region, and that they seem to be pressing forward with what is so far fairly limited counteroffensives, gradually regaining lost ground, but which do seem to be slowly acquiring momentum, perhaps in preparation for some bigger offensive which is coming. And there's also increasing reports that the Wagner organization and the various Russian supporting troops are continuing to make serious advances in Bakhmut city. In fact, the situation in Bakhmut city goes from bad to worse, but with Ukraine doing exactly what it did in Mariupol and to some extent in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk, refusing to pull its troops back from Bakhmut city. On the contrary, sending reinforcements there, which then get absorbed in the continuing cauldron, the emerging cauldron, which is now starting to evolve there. I have to say that it looks to me that we are getting ever closer to that position when events like the ones we saw in Mariupol, of a large grouping of Ukrainian troops trapped inside a city which should have been evacuated, emerge, leading eventually to the collapse of those troops and their eventual surrender. Now, I have to say that whilst that does prolong the fighting in Bakhmut city, I cannot for the life of me see the military logic of this. I'm not a military person, as I've said many times, but it does seem to me that throwing away the lives of soldiers in that kind of fashion makes no sense, whichever side is fighting and on any battlefield. Anyway, yesterday in my program, I discussed the latest comments of General Surovikin, and I pointed out that he'd made a huge impression in Russia as a commander who clearly had a clear sense of grip on the situation and who clearly had an operational plan. And of course, I mentioned that General Surovikin, in discussing the situation in Kherson region, was clearly leaving open the option that if the situation there deteriorated to the point of crisis for the Russians, that he would not hesitate in that case to prioritize the lives of his soldiers and of civilians. And if that involved a withdrawal across the Dnieper to the eastern bank, he would not hesitate in that kind of situation to do it. And entirely predictably, the British Ministry of Defence has seized on the same words and is saying this morning, and you can find this in the British media, that the Russians are now planning a withdrawal across the Dnieper River to the eastern bank of the Dnieper. Well, let me make it absolutely clear that is not what General Surovikin said. He said that if the situation deteriorated to that point where that kind of decision were taken in order to save the lives of his soldiers and of civilians, he would not hesitate to make that kind of decision. It's a contrast to the approach Ukraine has been taking in Bakhmut city and which we previously saw Ukraine take in Mariupol, where they hold on to every millimeter of ground long after this has lost all kind of military logic, sacrificing soldiers and indeed civilians in that kind of quixotic, reckless, irresponsible quest to keep these territories under Ukrainian control for as soon as possible. It's the contrast, in my opinion, between a military professional, which is what Surovikin, after all, is, and a military political leadership in Kiev, which is and continues to be obsessed by achieving political objectives. Anyway, and of course, amongst those presentational objectives, issues of face, if you like. Now, let me make it absolutely clear that all the indications are, and they've been pouring in over the last couple of hours, that the Russians are not planning a military withdrawal at this time across the Dnieper River. On the contrary, we're getting reports, or at least I'm getting reports. I can't fully corroborate their accuracy, but the reports I'm getting suggest that the Russians, for the moment, are intending to do the opposite, that they are reinforcing their forces west of the Dnieper River, that they're building up fortified lines, both along the existing front lines, in order to hold back any Ukrainian attacks, but that they are busy fortifying Kherson city itself. They're building artillery, they're building strong points, they're building trenches, underground communication systems, all of that sort of thing. It's the kind of thing that you would expect Surovikin to start to do. He talked about that indeed in his interview. He talked about hardening and fortifying the front lines, and that appears to be exactly what he's doing in Kherson region and in everywhere else. So combat engineers are being sent there. Officials have been placed under military control. I'm going to come to that later in this program. Civilian officials have been placed under military control. There's been a general tightening of control across the entire battlefields, and work is being done to harden the defences. That, so far, or so it seems to me, is the actual military objective. Not to retreat, but on the contrary, to dig in and repel if the situation becomes such, however, that a withdrawal is necessary, then a withdrawal will indeed be carried out. But that is not the plan at the moment. Now, yesterday, as it happens, we did see a significant attempt by Ukraine to launch some kind of offensive in Kherson region. Now, this appears to have been a fairly substantial affair, and it seems to have involved attacks from 3 different directions. But the biggest attack seems to have come from the direction of towards Berislav, along the west bank of the Dnieper River, with the presumed intention of eventually capturing the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. Now, all of these Ukrainian attacks were repelled. The Ukrainians were pushed back, in every case, to their original positions, and most importantly, they suffered heavy losses. Now, this is what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying about the most important attack, the one towards the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. It says that up to 3 Ukrainian battalions, including 1 armoured, attempted to break the defense of Russian troops towards Novaya Kamenka, Chernovy Yar, Kherson region. The enemy succeeded in wedging into the defense of Russian troops near Sukhanovo. Russian command that involved armoured reserve forces. Notice that there's now confirmation that there are armoured units, Russian armoured units, operating west of the Dnieper, organised ambush operations and caused considerable casualties amongst enemy units. The positions along the front line have been completely recovered. Over 200 Ukrainian personnel, 14 tanks, 16 armoured fighting vehicles and 7 motor vehicles have been eliminated. That means essentially destroyed. And then 3 tanks, 1 infantry fighting vehicle and 1 Ur-77 mine action system have been captured as trophies. 18 Ukrainian personnel surrendered. Now, that suggests a very fierce encounter battle with Ukraine suffering heavy losses. Now, I want to stress these are Russian claims. There's been virtually nothing said about this affair on the Ukrainian side. And of course, the Western media has completely ignored these Russian claims. So this is all we have. All we have is coming from the Russian side. But what the Russian Ministry of Defense is saying has been confirmed by various Russian observers, Russian telegram channels, and it seems to be true. Notice that several tanks, 3 to be precise, were captured, and that 18 Ukrainian troops actually surrendered, which is unusual in this war. It's unusual for there to be surrenders of significant numbers of troops in encounter battles, and in this case, it looks as if this was a pretty tough encounter battle, but one in which the Ukrainians came off decisively the losers. So that corresponds with what I was saying previously. It doesn't look as if at the moment the Russians are planning to withdraw from Kherson region or from Kherson city. On the contrary, the indications are that they are planning to dig in. Now, what do the Ukrainians propose to do in this kind of situation? Well, General Surovikin yesterday said that they're under orders to continue attacking in Kherson region, under orders from their NATO sponsors. And it's quite likely that despite the deteriorating weather conditions, despite the strengthening Russian defenses, despite all the problems, that is what they will continue to do. Now, there have been various claims about the number of Ukrainian troops who've been assembled around Kherson region, with some figures claiming that up to 60,000 men are located there. Well, all I will say is that these attacks that Ukraine has been launching in Kherson region every couple of days don't seem to me to reflect the power of a military force which numbers 60,000. We get about 1,000 men, apparently, sent in this particular column that has been so badly beaten up by the Russians north of the Novaya Kharkov dam. 1,000 men, out of whom the Russians claim 200 were killed and further 18 taken prisoner, with perhaps half the tank force, perhaps more than half the tank force, destroyed. I understand that some people say that this is all nothing more than reconnaissance to probe Russian defenses. Doesn't look like that to me, I have to say. I suspect that the Ukrainian tactic is not so much to carry out armed reconnaissance. It is to continue sending forces like this, hammering away at Russian defenses, accepting hideous losses, in the hope that Ukraine at some point strikes lucky. After all, they did achieve that at the beginning of October, when they were able to push an armoured column south up to the village of Duchany, despite the fact that they had defeats in that area previously, largely because my impression is that Russian defences in that particular sector had become fairly thin, and largely because Russian air operations on that particular time had become disrupted by difficult weather conditions. So, you know, it's possible that they might strike lucky again, but in the meantime, they're suffering very heavy casualties, which has been the pattern of this Kherson offensive since the outset, trying to do that, hammering against Russian defences, making very little progress, but perhaps from time to time hoping to achieve a lucky strike. That seems to me more the pattern here. So, what more can one say about the Kherson situation? Well, the Russians have been talking about Ukrainian attempts to blow up the or damage the Novaya Kakhovka Dam and to cause extremely heavy flooding in Kherson region. And this has been part of the justification for the evacuation of the civilian population, which we have been seeing. And I have to say, this has somewhat puzzled me initially, because as I've discussed in numerous programs, the Ukrainian missile attacks on the Novaya Kakhovka Dam and the railway bridge have up to now done comparatively little damage. The railway bridge has been operating normally until very recently. But a point which General Surovikin did make in his interview yesterday, it was a small point, is that the dam, the bridge across the dam, the railway bridge, is no longer operating at the moment. So what is going on? Well, apparently the Ukrainians, at least this is the Russians, what the Russians are saying, the Ukrainians are no longer trying to target the bridge itself, the bridge across the dam. They're trying to target the locks along the dam in order to create this flooding problem. And there was one report yesterday, the accuracy of which I'm in no position to confirm. I wonder whether it might be true, that what's been happening over the last couple of days is that Ukraine has been sending mines, floating mines, down the Dnieper River, trying to use them to attack the locks on the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. Perhaps these are not actually mines, perhaps they're drones of some kind. I'm not able to say. I'm not even able to say whether this is true. But if that is true, and I just want to stress this is one report amongst the scores I read every day, and in one that, by the way, its accuracy I can't confirm, but if it's true, then it might explain a few things. It might explain why Surovikin complained that the Ukrainians are thinking of using prohibited means, what he called prohibited means, to carry out this attack on the Novaya Kakhovka Dam. I'm not sure, by the way, that these attacks would be prohibited, but that's what Surovikin said. Perhaps unconventional as opposed to prohibited might be a more accurate description. But anyway, regardless of that, I can imagine that if there was a real worry that there is a threat of mines or drones, underwater drones, against the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, that the Russians might be taking precautions both to evacuate the civilian population and also to stop transit traffic across the bridge. Anyway, We will see how this situation develops. But I do want to stress again that as of this moment in time, there's no sign of a Russian pullback across the Dnieper River. And for the moment, whenever Ukraine has launched attacks in Kherson region, at least recently, since that attack in October, at the beginning of October, every one of the attacks that it's launched recently have been repelled with appalling losses. And whilst I'm on this subject, I do want to refer to an article by the historian Eric Zeus. I'm not quite sure how his name is pronounced, by the way, even though we've corresponded in the past. But he has commented about the inhumanity, the cruelty of Ukraine sending troops into battle, perhaps untrained troops, expending huge human losses in order to, as I said, achieve what might be considered more media effects than actual military ones. And I want to make it clear that I completely agree with this interpretation, with Eric Zeus's views about what Ukraine is doing. I find this method of conducting war appalling, and Eric Zeus makes the point that it appears to have been, well, he says it's been ordered by the NATO leadership. I'm not sure whether it's been ordered by the NATO leadership, but they surely know what's going on, and they seem to be going along with it. And if so, that is really, really terrible. Anyway, a bad day, as I said, for Ukraine on all the battlefronts. A continuing bad day for Ukraine in terms of the missile and drone strikes that Russia is continuing to mount across Ukraine. Now, it's been pointed out by several people that the Ukrainian energy system actually produces far more energy than Ukraine normally needs. There's enormous amount of systems redundancy, partly because this was a Soviet developed system and the Soviets tended to create large amount of redundancy in their electricity generating systems, but also because the shrinking of the Ukrainian economy, the shrinking of Ukraine's industrial base, which has been an ongoing process, by the way, extending all the way back to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, means that there is actually a very large degree of excess capacity in the system, because obviously the Soviet conceived energy power system was built with a much larger industrial base in mind. So it's going to take a very long time, or at least an awful lot of missile and strikes and damage, before the system is indeed damaged beyond the point where it can provide Ukraine with basic electricity and electric power and those sort of things. But it does seem that after 9 days of this missile and drone offensive, the Russians are getting ever closer to that point where they will indeed manage to bring down the power system. And again, I have to say that this is a terrible thing for Ukraine. And given that there doesn't seem to be anything that Ukraine can do to prevent it, and given that the Western powers seem to have no solution to this problem, other than to hope that the Russians run out of missiles, of which, by the way, there is no sign, it seems to me to be yet another reason why Ukraine ought to be considering negotiations. Now, these attacks on the energy system have inevitably brought up the topic of war crimes, and Ursula von der Leyen, the President of the European Commission, has talked in that way, as have many others. I have to say that I think that this is far from being straightforward. On balance, in fact, I'm going to say that I doubt that this is a war crime. I'm not an expert on war crimes law, because I can see that these attacks on the energy system do have a genuine military purpose. The Russians, it seems to me, have an arguable case. I'm not saying it's a good case or a correct case. I'm not a judge, and I'm not, as I said, a war crimes law expert. But it does seem to me that they have an arguable case that this is a dual-use system. In other words, it's a system which, whilst of course it does provide energy for Ukraine's civilian economy, it is also essential for Ukraine's conduct of military operations, and the Russians can reasonably point out that those Ukrainian military operations do involve attacks on civilian targets in places like Donetsk City, Crimea, as we've seen recently, the Crimean Bridge, and of course, if there really is a plan to blow up the Novaya Kakhovka Dam, well, that would be an analogous attack also. So I think that this war crimes issue should be parked to one side, all the more so as it's no different, if we're going to be straightforward about this, than what the Western powers have themselves done in wars that they have waged in all sorts of places, like Iraq, Libya, and other Yugoslavia, and other countries like that. Indeed, I remember during the NATO intervention against Libya, of course, arguably it wasn't a formal NATO intervention, it was Britain, France, and the United States, the bombing war they launched against Libya in 2011, that one of the targets of that bombing war was the great man-made river, a huge irrigation project that Libya's former leader, Muammar Gaddafi, had created, and which provided irrigation for lots of desert regions in Libya. And I could never see, I was completely unable to see what the purpose of the attacks on this irrigation project was. But those attacks did occur, together, by the way, with attacks which, so far as I could see, were clearly intended to target Gaddafi himself. So, let's bear in mind that Western critics of Russian attacks on the Ukrainian energy system are perhaps oblivious, unsurprisingly oblivious, to the fact that the Western powers have done similar or perhaps worse things themselves. Now, it should not be taken, by the way, to say that if these attacks are war crimes, what the Russians are doing in Ukraine, that would justify them simply because the Western powers have committed war crimes or possible war crimes doesn't mean that the Russians are entitled to commit war crimes themselves. But as I said, I think that there is an arguable case, but that doesn't make this destruction of Ukraine's energy system any the less harrowing for Ukrainian civilians. What it does point to, however, again, and this is something that I've spoken about so many times, is the urgency of starting negotiations. I've discussed this so often, I'm not going to repeat myself in detail. But I come back to what Eric Zeus was saying about the inhumanity of sending poorly trained Ukrainian soldiers into the killing fields of Ukraine, where they're killed in large numbers, 200 in one place, according to the Russians, and they were in control of the battlefield in this case, so perhaps they know, perhaps they're accurate in what they're saying, and as I said, their claims about the destruction of tanks and armoured vehicles are almost certainly accurate. Anyway, 200 men killed in one place, sending what one does suspect are increasingly poorly trained Ukrainian soldiers into these battles, reinforcing places like Bakhmut city, which look increasingly undefendable. It doesn't make any kind of sense to me. And continuing to engage with Russia, even whilst Ukraine's energy system slowly collapses, or perhaps not slowly at all, rapidly collapses. Again, it doesn't make any kind of sense to me. Bear in mind that the Russians have taken 8 months before they've launched attacks of this nature. Now, again, that doesn't justify launching these attacks in itself, but it does show that when the Russians said at the outset of the war that they did not want to attack civilian infrastructure, at that point they were telling the truth. They've changed their position since, because that is the nature of war. The imperative of war is always to achieve victory, victory being defined by the political objectives that one sets oneself, and that imperative to achieve victory always, so it seems to me, leads one inevitably to do ever more terrible things. And that's one reason why war should be avoided whenever possible. But anyway, regardless of that, the Russians do seem, at least initially, to have balked from attacking civilian infrastructure, clearly because they hoped for a short war, and one which would end in a political and diplomatic settlement with Ukraine. But the war has dragged on, largely because, in fact entirely because, the Western powers have blocked the real efforts of both sides to achieve a diplomatic settlement, efforts which almost came to fruit in the Istanbul negotiations at the end of March. And of course they have escalated the war by, instead of supporting a process of negotiations, sending military support to Ukraine and urging Ukraine to launch all these various counteroffensives which have caused so many enormous human losses. The result is, as Putin made clear in his press conference in Astana, that the Russians, who started out without having the intentions of destroying the Ukrainian state, are now contemplating the possibility that at the end of this war, the Ukrainian state may cease to exist. Not something which is their policy, let me repeat, but a possibility that they're now for the first time entertaining as a possible outcome of the existing war. And in the meantime, Ukrainian civilians are suffering ever greater losses, and greater hardship, just as Ukrainian soldiers are dying in ever greater numbers. Given that the option of negotiations was always there, negotiations which would have preserved Ukraine and might have resolved the Ukrainian crisis, given that the Russians still say that negotiations are the correct, are something that they're prepared to entertain themselves. Surely this deterioration of Ukraine's energy system, not to mention these losses that Ukraine is suffering on the battlefields, wholly out of proportion to the losses that Russia is suffering. Surely all of this points once more to the need for negotiations. Well, I've said this so many times, I'm not going to dwell on it anymore, nor am I going to discuss in this program the gathering economic crisis which we see in every part of the West, which is also a consequence of the war, and of course the gathering political crisis which has now reached boiling point in Britain, and which I suspect we will before very long start to see also take hold in other places like Germany and also, by the way, the United States. But let me now return to a topic which I said I would cover in my video yesterday, which is the decisions that poured out of the Security Council meeting that Putin chaired yesterday. And we got a whole series of enactments announcing martial law in the 4 regions that have just been incorporated into Russia. Also, higher readiness alerts in 3 other regions, 3 regions, Belgorod, Krasnodar, and 1 other, which were part of the Russian Federation already before the war began. As I've said yesterday, these decisions, the martial law decisions, are basically streamlining decisions. All 4 of the regions, Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson, Zaporozhye, were already in a state of martial law before these decrees, yesterday's decrees, were announced. Putin himself made that point, by the way, in his introductory comments to the Security Council. The decrees that took place yesterday were to bring the martial law situation in these 4 regions into conformity with Russian law. So it was, if you like, a legal tidying up measure, one which will, however, tighten the control the Kremlin has over the civilian administrations of these 4 regions, which until just 2 weeks ago were nominally independent of Russia. I suspect, as I said yesterday, that before very long we're going to see a single civilian administrator appointed to take overall charge of the civilian administrations in these 4 regions, by analogy with what we see in Russia itself, where each region, oblast, has its own governor, but groups of regions form parts of what are called federal districts, with a district representative appointed by the president, by Putin himself, who supervises the work of these governors who are elected by their specific regions. It's a structure that was created by Putin shortly after he became president, as part of the vertical of power that was created at that point in time, bitterly criticized, by the way, by some people in the West. I think in Russia itself, it's been seen as a major factor stabilizing the administration after the chaos of the 1990s, and I expect before long we will see it expanded to include the 4 regions. Anyway, suffice to say that the martial law decrees, to my mind, are of little significance. However, there was another decree which is much more important. And I'm going to read it out in full. This is taken from the Kremlin's website. And it says the following: instructions on meeting the needs of the special military operation. The President approved a list of instructions on meeting the needs arising during the special military operation. So, in fact, we've had a whole series of decrees from Putin, confirmed following a discussion in the Security Council, and we don't have the texts of the individual decrees, but the Kremlin website has provided a summary, and I'm going to read it out. The instruction to the government of the Russian Federation has to do with setting up a coordinating council under the government of the Russian Federation in order to meet the needs arising during the special military operation, including to secure the supply and repair of weapons, military and special equipment, material, medical and sanitary services, repairs and restoration, construction, installation and other works, and logistics. It is envisaged that this council will be headed by the Prime Minister, that is to say by Prime Minister BITCHUTE, and include representatives of the Ministry of Defence, the Ministry of the Interior, the Ministry of Emergencies, the National Guard, the Federal Security Service, the Foreign Intelligence Service, the Chief Directorate for Special Programmes of the Russian President, other federal executive bodies, and the State Council of the Russian Federation. The State Council Commission on State and Municipal Government has been instructed to ensure the coordination between the regional bodies of state power as they introduce a response at various levels, as well as organise interaction between regional and federal state bodies in the implementation of the above activities. The Coordinating Council is instructed to determine the target objective for meeting the needs arising during the special military operation, the key efforts and deadlines to meet this objective, as well as the government members responsible for each effort. Now, this is a very important decree or series of decrees, and it, in my opinion, looks back to a military political structure that was created during the Second World War. The State Defense Committee, which was chaired, by the way, by no less a person than Joseph Stalin, who was at that time, like BITCHUTE, the Prime Minister, in other words, the head of government, as well as being the head of the Communist Party. And the State Defense Committee, the GKO, as it was called, had the function during the Second World War of coordinating every part of the civilian administration and of the civilian economy in order to meet the needs of the front, in order to ensure that the military, the Soviet military during the Second World War, was supplied with all the material it needed, the weapons, the food, the logistics, all of that kind of thing. And in order to ensure that, the State Defense Council was given sweeping powers which had the force of law. In other words, they were binding on every element of the civilian administration within what was, of course, at that time, the Soviet Union. So it became, during the Second World War, the primary executive body of the Soviet governmental system, superseding, to a great extent, by the way, the Council of Ministers, even the Soviet Communist Party's Politburo. Now, this council, this new coordinating council, is not obviously going to be as powerful as the State Defense Committee. Note that Putin himself is not apparently a member. He's not going to chair this committee. And it's not difficult to understand why. The reason is that Russia is not in a state of war. It's not at war with, you know, a country like Germany, as it was in the 1940s. This is a much more limited operation being conducted in the 4 regions and in Ukraine. So there's no need to replicate the State Defense Committee in its full form. But a committee, a coordinating council, has been created with analogous powers, and one has to assume that its powers are also going to be, its decisions are going to be binding on civilian administration, on the civilian administrations, on the economic ministries, in exactly the same way as those of the State Defense Committee were during the Second World War. So if the military in Ukraine, the Russian military in Ukraine, for example, need more tanks or need tanks to be repaired more quickly, then this committee, this council, in which the ministry is represented, has the function of ensuring that those tanks are produced or repaired more quickly, and is able to give instructions to various enterprises within Russia, mobilize, in other words, those enterprises to ensure that higher tempo of tank production is achieved. So this is a pretty big step. And again, it points to 2 things. Firstly, it points to the fact that this period of the special military operation, as it was, aimed firstly to achieve a negotiated solution, and then afterwards, when it became a negotiated solution was not going to be achieved, carried out in a fairly quiet way through the summer, that period has ended. We've had the incorporation of the 4 regions into Russia. We've had the mobilization of 300,000 men. We've had the appointment of General Surovikin, who, by the way, I strongly suspect is going to be an ex officio member of this coordinating committee. And now we have the coordinating committee set up to ensure that any supply issues, any logistic issues, any construction issues are resolved. So, you know, if more concrete is needed, for example, to set up fortifications, the military commanders can contact this committee, the relevant officials in this committee, who will then ensure that concrete is indeed provided. So that period of the special military operation, which we've seen in the past, is now over. We now have a decision which, alongside the mobilization of reservists, the military side of the things, is starting to point towards a greater mobilization of the civilian economy to ensure that the needs of the military in Ukraine are fully met. So that's one thing. So it points in some ways to a much higher tempo of the war. In other words, a much bigger gear shift upwards. It means that from a limited operation, which is what we've had previously, we now have a much bigger operation with the civilian economy committed to supporting it. Now, that's one thing, but it also suggests, again, that the military operations themselves are also going to go into a much higher gear, because obviously the fact that there's need for extra logistical, technical support from the civilian economy, that also points clearly to the fact that the military are indeed planning or so it seems to me, very substantial offensives indeed over the next few months. And it could also mean that the Russians are making preparations in case the West escalates even further, that if there is an attempt by the Western powers to continue to support Ukraine beyond the end of this year, into the spring and summer of 2023, that the Russians now have the administrative organs in place. So this is an interesting development, and in terms of understanding what the Western powers might do, note that the Foreign Intelligence Service, the SVR, Russia's major intelligence gathering organization, has a representative on this coordinating council, alongside, for example, the Federal Security Service, the National Guard, the primary bodies that deal with internal security. So this is going to be a very, very powerful council indeed, though one which will remain subordinate to the Security Council chaired by Putin himself, which will continue to be the primary policy body in Russia. Now, I would quickly say that I don't expect this, and I don't think this is the plan. If Russia does go over to a full war footing, then of course we will see Putin himself presumably assume chairmanship of this council as well, and possibly the Security Council as it exists today, and this coordinating council will merge. The person who, by the way, understands these hierarchical structures best is John Helmer. If you want to get a sense of how the structure of the Russian military civilian system works in wartime, his website, Dancing with Bears, is the best at that. He's also discussed, if you like, the structure that was created by Russia during the First and Second World Wars, the Stavka, and he often refers to the similar bodies of military civilian power in Russia today as the Stavka, even though there's no formal body called the Stavka in today's Russia. The Stavka was the headquarters, if you like, the civilian military headquarters that Russia had in the two world wars. It is not, by the way, an abbreviation. It's an actual word, Russian word. I believe it means the tent. It means it brings together all the various elements of the Russian system into a kind of unified headquarters. It seems to me that this coordination council is not yet a formal recreation of the Stavka of the Second World War, but it is a significant step in that direction. So this is an important decree, or series of decrees, far more important, in my opinion, than the martial law declarations, which are the ones that have attracted the most attention. Well, that's me for the day. A very bad day yesterday for Ukraine. Bad on the battlefields, bad in respect of their energy systems. And we see that the Russians are continuing to work out and are now purposefully working out all the various systems, the structures that they feel that they need to put in place for the much bigger war which is coming, the knockout blow which is coming. We've seen the mobilization, incorporation of the 4 regions into Russia, the appointment of a single commander. You could almost call him a deputy commander-in-chief, Surovikin, fulfilling something of a role analogous to that of Marshal Zhukov in the Second World War. And we now see, as I said, a first step, in fact, not just a first step, but a very big step towards setting up something like the GKO and the Stavka of the Second World War to supplement and coordinate all of these developments on the military side. The next few months in Ukraine are going to be very interesting, and that is a huge understatement. Well, thank you for joining me again for this program. I look forward to you joining me again for future programs on this channel. Please remember that you can find us on other platforms: Locals, Rumble, ODYSEE, BitChute, and of course Telegram, and of course also Rofkin, where we are now also active, and where, by the way, you can get a preview of many of the videos that we make, Alex Christoforou and I make on the Duran. We publish some of our videos on Rofkin first in their raw form, their raw unedited form, before they're actually edited and posted on the other platforms. So if you want to see us at work, Alex and I at work, but also get a preliminary insight into our thinking on any particular topic, well, join us on Rofkin and you will find us there. You'll be able to get that there. And last but not least, I would also suggest that you join us on Locals, specifically on Locals, because of course on Locals every Wednesday I do my live streams. I had a very successful one yesterday and a very wonderful one yesterday. And of course, if you want to put questions to me, well, that's your chance. Let me reiterate again, live streams exclusively on Locals from me every Wednesday. You can join us there. And of course, if you want to support our work, don't forget you can do so by going to our shop, buying yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those wonderful things. And also, of course, you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. Last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to check your subscription to this channel, and also tick the like button if you've liked this video. Well, that's me for the day. More from me soon. Thank you and have a very good day. Until then.